The woman stood at the church doors, rain soaking through her thin coat, staring at the locked entrance like it was the last door in the world. Her name was Margaret, 43 years old, and she'd driven 2 hours through a storm just to be told she wasn't welcome. Inside, through the stained glass, she could see shadows moving, hear hymns rising, feel the warmth she'd been searching for her entire life. But the sign on the door said it all. Members-only service. No visitors today. Margaret had grown up believing churches were sanctuaries, places where broken people found shelter. Her mother used to say, "When the world closes its doors, God's house stays open." But standing there in the downpour, shivering, she realized her mother had been wrong, or maybe the world had changed. Maybe God's house had learned to lock its doors too. She'd come because she had nowhere else to go. 3 months ago, her husband Daniel left without explanation, taking their savings and leaving behind only a note that said, "I can't do this anymore." The apartment went next, then the car, then her job at the bookstore when she couldn't stop crying during shifts. Friends disappeared one by one, their sympathy running dry faster than her tears. And Margaret, who'd spent her whole life being the strong one, the capable one, the one everyone leaned on, found herself completely alone. That morning, she'd woken up on her sister's couch, the 5th time that month, and heard the argument through the walls. Her brother-in-law's voice, sharp and final. "She needs to figure her life out. We can't keep doing this." Her sister's response was quieter, defensive, but Margaret heard the exhaustion in it, the resignation. So she packed her single bag, left a note thanking them, and drove until she saw the church steeple rising above the pines. The building was beautiful, old stone with ivy climbing the walls, the kind of place that looked like it had been standing since the beginning of time. Margaret had never been there before, but desperation doesn't ask for familiarity. She needed prayer. She needed community. She needed someone to tell her she wasn't disappearing. But the doors stayed locked, and the rain kept falling, and through the window she saw a man in a suit glance her way, then quickly look back at his hymnal. No one came. No one opened the door. No one even acknowledged her standing there, drenched and trembling, pressing her palm against the glass like a ghost trying to reach the living. Margaret remembered a different time, years ago, when she and Daniel had first met at a church potluck. He'd been the kind of man who made everyone feel seen, who remembered names and asked about people's mothers, and always showed up early to help set up chairs. She'd fallen in love with his kindness before his smile, before his laugh, before anything else. He'd proposed to her in a chapel, not unlike this one, on a Sunday morning with light streaming through colored glass, and she'd believed, truly believed, that God had brought them together. For 15 years they'd built a life. Not perfect, never perfect, but real. Sunday mornings together in the 4th pew from the front. Wednesday night Bible studies in their living room. Mission trips to Appalachia, where they'd rebuilt porches for elderly widows. Daniel had been her partner in everything, her best friend, her constant. And then, somewhere along the way, something shifted. She couldn't pinpoint the moment. Maybe it was gradual, like erosion wearing down stone. Maybe it happened all at once and she'd been too blind to see. The fight started small. Dishes left in the sink. Forgotten anniversaries. Long silences at dinner. Then they grew. Arguments about money they didn't have. Accusations about time they weren't spending together. Resentments that festered like wounds neither of them knew how to heal. Margaret had suggested counseling, had begged him to talk to their pastor, had done everything she could think of to save what they'd built. But Daniel had already left in his mind, long before his body followed. She remembered the last real conversation they'd had, 3 weeks before he vanished. They'd been sitting at the kitchen table, cold coffee between them, and she'd asked him what he wanted, what would make him happy. He'd looked at her with eyes so tired they seemed ancient and said, "I don't know anymore. I don't know if I ever knew." And that had terrified her more than anger ever could, because anger you can fight. Apathy just swallows you whole. The note he'd left was on the kitchen counter, weighted down by his wedding ring. 4 sentences that destroyed her world. "I can't do this anymore. I need to find myself. This isn't about you. Please don't try to contact me." She'd read it 17 times that first day, looking for hidden meaning, searching for the words that would make it make sense. But there were none. He was gone, and she was alone, and the silence in their apartment had been so loud she thought she'd go mad. After 20 minutes standing at the locked church door, she turned away, her shoes squelching in the mud, her breath coming in short gasps. She sat in her sister's borrowed car, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at nothing. The heater didn't work. The windshield fogged, and Margaret whispered into the silence, "If you're real, I need you to show me, because I don't know how to keep going." She drove aimlessly after that, the storm turning the roads into rivers, the sky so dark it felt like midnight even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. She passed strip malls and gas stations, trailer parks and abandoned factories, until she found herself on a dirt road she didn't recognize. The car sputtered, coughed and died right there in the middle of nowhere. Margaret sat in the sudden quiet, rain drumming on the roof, and laughed. It was a broken, hollow sound, the kind of laugh that comes when crying doesn't cut it anymore. Of course the car died. Of course she was stranded. Of course this was how it ended, alone in the mud with nothing and no one. She thought about her mother then, about the woman who'd raised her to believe in miracles and providence and the goodness of people. Her mother had died 5 years ago, cancer taking her slowly, painfully, but she'd never lost her faith. Even at the end, morphine-clouded and barely conscious, she'd smiled and said, "I'll see you again, sweetheart. God's got plans for you. Big ones." Margaret had held her hand and nodded, believing it because her mother believed it, because faith was supposed to be contagious. Her mother had been a woman of unshakable conviction, the kind who'd pray over grocery lists and thank God for parking spaces and see divine intervention in coincidences most people dismissed. She'd raised Margaret in a small Pentecostal church, where people spoke in tongues and fell out in the Spirit, and believed wholeheartedly that miracles happened every single day. Margaret had inherited some of that faith, though hers had always been quieter, more intellectual, less demonstrative. She believed in God the way she believed in gravity, invisible but constant, holding everything together. But sitting in that dead car, soaked and shaking, Margaret wondered if her mother had been wrong about everything. Maybe there were no plans, maybe there was no purpose, maybe life was just random chaos, and some people got lucky while others drowned, and faith was just a story we told ourselves to make the drowning easier. She got out because staying felt worse, and started walking, not knowing where she was going, just moving because movement felt like the only thing left. The rain plastered her hair to her face, soaked through her jeans, filled her shoes with cold water. She walked past fields of nothing, past trees bending in the wind, past signs so faded she couldn't read them. Her legs ached, her lungs burned, her whole body screamed at her to stop, to lie down, to give up. But something deeper than exhaustion kept her moving, some stubborn spark that refused to be extinguished. And then she saw the light, small, warm, flickering through the trees like a candle refusing to go out. Margaret stopped, wiping rain from her eyes, trying to focus. It was a building, tiny, leaning to one side like it might collapse any second. Not a church, not exactly, but something close. A chapel, maybe, or what used to be one. She walked toward it, her legs shaking, her heart pounding, and when she reached the door, it opened before she could knock. An old man stood there, thin as a reed, with white hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. He didn't say anything, just stepped aside, and Margaret walked in without thinking, too cold and tired to question it. The inside was simple. Wooden benches, a small altar, candles burning in jars along the walls. It smelled like dust and wax and something else, something she couldn't name, but that made her chest ache. The old man gestured to a bench near the front, and she sat, water pooling around her feet. He brought her a blanket, rough and worn but warm, and a cup of something hot that tasted like herbs and honey. She drank it slowly, feeling the heat spread through her, thawing parts of her she didn't know had frozen. He sat across from her, not speaking, just waiting, and Margaret realized she didn't know what to say. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with meaning. Margaret studied the old man's face, the deep lines carved by time and weather, the gentle patience in his expression. He looked like someone who'd seen every kind of human suffering and hadn't been broken by it, someone who'd learned to hold pain without drowning in it. Finally, she whispered, "I tried to go to church today, they wouldn't let me in." The old man nodded, like he'd heard that story 1,000 times. "Did they say why?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost musical. She shook her head. There was a sign. Members only. I wasn't one of them. He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "Do you know what a church is?" She frowned, confused. "A building where people worship God," she answered. He smiled, sad and gentle. "No, child. A church is people. The building is just wood and stone. The people are the church. And if the people turn you away, they've forgotten what they were built for." Margaret felt tears rising, hot and sudden, and she couldn't stop them. "I don't know what I did wrong," she said, her voice breaking. "I've tried to be good, I've tried to be kind, I've worked hard, I've loved people. And everything fell apart anyway. My husband left, my friends left, my family's tired of me. And God—" She paused, her breath hitching. "God feels 1,000,000 miles away." The old man stood, walked to the altar, and picked up one of the candles. He brought it back, holding it between them so the flame danced in the dim light. "This," he said, "is you, burning, still here, still giving light even when everything around you is dark. You think you're extinguished, but look, you're still flickering." She stared at the flame, mesmerized, and he continued, "The storm doesn't care about your light. The wind wants to blow it out. The rain wants to drown it. But here's the truth, Margaret." He said her name even though she hadn't told him, and she didn't question it. "The flame doesn't survive because it's strong. It survives because something keeps it lit." "What?" she whispered. "What keeps it lit?" He set the candle down between them. "The same thing that brought you here tonight. The same thing that made you knock on a church door even when you had nothing left. The same thing that keeps you breathing when breathing feels impossible. You call it desperation. I call it faith." Margaret shook her head violently. "I don't have faith anymore. I'm empty. There's nothing left." The old man leaned forward, his eyes intense but kind. "Empty things make the most room for filling, and you're not as empty as you think. You're here, aren't you? You're still asking questions. You're still looking for answers. That's not emptiness. That's hunger. And hunger means you're alive." "But I prayed," she said, her voice rising with frustration. "I prayed so hard. I begged God to save my marriage, to help me keep my job, to make my family understand. And nothing happened. Every door closed. Every prayer went unanswered. So either God doesn't exist or God doesn't care, and I don't know which is worse." The old man was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "What if the doors closed because you needed to find a different path? What if the prayers were answered, just not the way you wanted? What if God was saying no because yes would have destroyed you?" Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to rage against that logic, but something in her recognized the truth of it. She thought about her marriage, about the slow suffocation of living with someone who'd stopped seeing her, about the job that had drained every ounce of joy from her life, about the family who'd turned help into obligation and love into burden. Maybe losing everything hadn't been punishment, maybe it had been release. She didn't know how to respond, so she just sat there, wrapped in the blanket, staring at the candle, feeling something shift inside her. The old man stood again, this time walking to a small door at the back of the chapel. He opened it and she saw another room, darker, colder, with rain leaking through cracks in the ceiling. "Come," he said, "there's something you need to see." She followed, uncertain, her wet shoes leaving prints on the floor. Inside the room was a table covered in letters, hundreds of them, stacked in piles, tied with string, yellowed with age. The old man gestured to them. "These are prayers," he said. "From people like you. People who came here broken, lost, angry at God, angry at the world." Margaret picked one up, unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. "Dear God, I don't know if you hear me anymore. I don't know if you care. But I'm drowning, and I need help." She looked up at the old man. "Did he get help?" she asked. The old man nodded. He did. Not the way he expected. Not the way he wanted. But he got what he needed. She picked up another letter, then another, reading fragments of pain and hope and rage and surrender. One was from a woman whose daughter had overdosed. Another from a man who'd lost his farm to the bank. A teenager who'd been kicked out for being gay. A mother whose son had died in a war she didn't understand. Each one a story like hers. Each one a heart cracked open. One letter caught her attention. The ink faded but still readable. "I lost my son today. He was 6 years old. A car ran a red light and took him while he was riding his bike. Everyone keeps saying God has a plan, but what kind of plan includes dead children? What kind of God lets this happen? I don't want to believe anymore. It hurts too much. Margaret's hands trembled holding that letter. Did she? Margaret couldn't finish the question. The old man knew what she was asking. She did. It took years, but she found a way to live with the grief instead of being consumed by it. She started a foundation for child safety, lobbied for better traffic laws, turned her pain into purpose, not because the pain went away, but because she refused to let it be meaningless. And each one, the old man said, was answered. Not always with miracles, not always with happy endings, but always with something. A sign, a moment of peace, a person who showed up at the right time, a door that opened when all the others closed. Margaret felt her throat tighten. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Because," he said, "you need to know you're not alone. You need to know that every person who walked through that door felt exactly what you're feeling. Abandoned, forgotten, invisible. And every single one of them learned the same truth." "What truth?" she whispered. He looked at her with those ancient eyes. "That God doesn't live in buildings. God lives in moments. In the stranger who gives you a blanket. In the candle that stays lit. In the voice inside you that says, 'Keep going,' even when everything says stop. You didn't find God in that church today because God wasn't there. God was in the storm, pushing you here." She wanted to argue, to say that was too convenient, too neat, but she couldn't, because standing in that room, surrounded by the prayers of strangers who'd survived their darkness, she felt it. A presence, a warmth, a whisper in her bones that said, "You're seen." The old man led her back to the main room, and they sat again, the candle still burning between them. He told her stories then, about the people who'd come before her. The woman who lost her child and thought she'd never smile again, but found purpose volunteering at a shelter. The man who lost his business and discovered he was a gifted teacher. The teenager who ran away from home and built a family from friends who became brothers and sisters. He told her about a woman named Patricia who'd come to the chapel 10 years ago, soaking wet just like Margaret, after her husband had beaten her so badly she'd lost hearing in one ear. Patricia had no money, no education, 3 children depending on her, and a restraining order that felt like paper against a man who didn't respect boundaries. She'd sat in the same spot Margaret was sitting now, and she'd asked the old man the same question. "What do I do now?" The old man had told her the same thing he was about to tell Margaret. You survive, one breath at a time, one step at a time, one small decision at a time. Patricia had left that night with nothing but a blanket and a phone number for a women's shelter. She'd spent 2 years rebuilding herself, working night shifts at a diner, getting her GED, applying for scholarships. Now she ran a non-profit, helping domestic violence survivors find housing and legal support. The old man showed Margaret a picture. Patricia smiling, surrounded by women she'd helped, standing in front of a building with her name on it. He told her about a man named Vincent who'd lost everything in the recession. His construction business folded. His house foreclosed. His wife left, taking their 2 daughters. He'd come to the chapel planning to end his life, had pills in his pocket and a note written. But something made him walk through the door first. The old man had sat with him all night, not preaching, not fixing, just being present. Vincent had left at dawn without taking the pills. 2 years later, he came back to show the old man his electrician's license and pictures of his daughters at his new apartment. Not a fairy tale ending. He still struggled, but he was alive and that mattered. None of them got their old lives back, the old man said, but they all found new ones, better ones sometimes, different ones, always. Because that's what happens when you lose everything. You get to rebuild from scratch, and this time you build something true. Margaret listened, and for the first time in months, she felt something other than despair. She felt possibility. Small, fragile, but real. "What do I do now?" she asked. "Where do I go?" The old man stood, walked to the door and opened it. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearing, stars beginning to emerge. "You go forward," he said simply. "You take one step, then another. You stop waiting for permission to exist. You stop asking broken people to fix you. You start asking yourself what you want to build. And you trust that every step, even the painful ones, is leading you somewhere you need to be." She stood, folded the blanket and handed it back to him. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with every part of her. He smiled. "Don't thank me. Thank yourself for not giving up. Thank the storm for pushing you here. Thank the locked door for making you find a different one." Margaret walked out into the night, the air fresh and cold, the stars brilliant overhead. She didn't know where she'd sleep that night. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew she wasn't the same woman who'd stood at that church door begging to be let in. She was someone different now, someone who'd stopped waiting for the world to save her and started saving herself. She walked back down the dirt road, and when she reached her car, it started on the first try. She didn't question it. She just drove, following the stars, following the pull in her chest, following the quiet voice that said, "You're not done yet." The first week was the hardest. Margaret found a room in a boarding house, a cramped space that smelled like mildew and old cigarettes. But it was hers, and the rent was cheap enough that she could manage it with what little savings she had left. The wallpaper was peeling, the radiator clanked all night, and she could hear her neighbors fighting through the thin walls. But it was shelter, and shelter was more than she'd had standing in that rain. She got a job washing dishes at a diner called Rosie's, the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee at 4 in the morning, and the menu hadn't changed since 1978. The work was brutal, the kind that made her hands crack and bleed, that left her so exhausted she'd collapse into bed without showering. But it was honest work, and it was hers, and nobody there knew who she'd been before or cared about her story. They just cared whether the dishes were clean. The other dishwasher was a woman named Ruth, 62 years old with tattoos covering both arms and a laugh that sounded like gravel shaking in a can. Ruth had been homeless for 3 years before landing this job, had lost 2 sons to addiction and a husband to prison, and she treated every shift like a gift. She taught Margaret how to stack plates efficiently, how to spot the good tips in the jar that the waitresses shared, how to make the work bearable by singing under her breath. One night, during the late shift when the diner was empty, except for a trucker nursing cold coffee, Ruth asked Margaret what brought her here. Margaret hesitated, then told her everything. About Daniel leaving, about the church doors, about the old man in the chapel. Ruth listened without interrupting, without offering empty platitudes, and when Margaret finished, Ruth just nodded and said, "Sounds about right. God's got a funny way of showing up, never when you want him, always when you need him." Ruth had her own philosophy about God, shaped by years of living rough. "God ain't in the big moments," she'd say while scrubbing a pot. "God's in the small stuff. The cook who saves you extra fries, the stranger who gives you their umbrella, the morning you wake up and realize you made it through another night. That's God. Not the fire and brimstone. The quiet mercies." Margaret started volunteering at the community center on her days off, helping serve meals to people even more desperate than she was. She met women who'd been trafficked, men who'd come back from wars with minds that wouldn't let them sleep, teenagers who'd aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. She met people who'd lost everything and were still standing, still fighting, still believing in something even when that something was hard to name. One evening, a young woman came in, maybe 25, with a black eye and a toddler on her hip. She sat in the corner, not eating, just staring at nothing while her daughter played with a broken toy. Margaret recognized that look. That's what drowning looks like when you're still breathing. She walked over, sat down without asking, and said, "I don't know your story, but I know that look. And I know it gets better. Not easier, but better." The woman looked at her with eyes full of tears. "How?" she whispered. "How does it get better?" Margaret thought about the locked church door, about the storm, about the old man who'd given her a blanket when she needed it most. "You find one person who sees you," she said. "Then you become that person for someone else. That's how." The woman's name was Jasmine, and she'd left her boyfriend after he'd hit her in front of their daughter for the 3rd time. She had $17, a bag of clothes, and a restraining order that felt meaningless. Margaret gave her the number for the shelter, helped her fill out the paperwork, sat with her while she cried, and when Jasmine looked at her and said, "Why are you helping me?" Margaret answered, "Because someone helped me when I needed it. Now I'm passing it forward." That became her purpose, not saving everyone because she couldn't, not fixing everything because she wasn't capable, but showing up, being present, offering the same grace she'd received in that chapel, one person at a time, one moment at a time. 3 months later, Margaret stood in a community center basement, surrounded by women like her. Women who'd lost jobs, lost marriages, lost hope. She'd started a support group, small at first, just 5 people meeting on Tuesday nights. But it grew, because broken people recognize each other, because pain connects deeper than comfort ever could. She told them about the locked church door, about the storm, about the old man in the chapel. She told them about the candle still burning, and when she finished, a woman in the back raised her hand and said, "I needed to hear that. I've been standing at my own locked door for months." Margaret smiled. "Then stop knocking," she said. "Find a different door. Build your own if you have to, because the world doesn't get to decide your worth. You do." And as the women nodded, some crying, some smiling, she felt it again. That presence, that warmth, that whisper that said, "This is why you survived." The group became her lifeline as much as theirs. Every Tuesday night, women gathered in that basement sharing stories that would break most people's hearts. Stories of abuse and addiction, of children taken away and dreams deferred, of systems that failed and people who betrayed. But they also shared victories, small ones mostly. A week sober, a job interview, a night without nightmares, a moment when they'd looked in the mirror and recognized themselves again. Margaret learned their names, their histories, their fears. She learned that Linda had been married to a pastor who preached love on Sundays and threw plates at her head on Mondays. That Carmen had lost custody of her son because she couldn't afford a lawyer to fight her ex-husband's lies. That Yvette had been clean for 2 years, but still woke up every morning craving the drugs that had stolen a decade of her life. Each story was different, but they all shared the same core truth. They'd all been abandoned by the systems and people who were supposed to protect them. One woman, Linda, had been coming to the group for 6 months. She'd been married to that pastor, a man the community revered, who'd abused her behind closed doors while preaching about love from the pulpit. When she'd finally found the courage to leave, the congregation had sided with him, calling her a liar, a troublemaker, a woman trying to destroy a good man's reputation. She'd lost her church, her community, her faith in everything. During one meeting, Linda stood up, her voice shaking, and said, "I went back to a church last Sunday, a different one, and when they asked if I was new, I told them my story. I told them everything, the abuse, the lies, the betrayal, and they didn't turn me away. They didn't call me a liar. They prayed with me, for me, and I cried so hard I couldn't breathe, because I thought God had abandoned me, but He didn't. The building abandoned me, the people abandoned me, but God was waiting somewhere else." The room erupted in applause, and Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. "That's it," she said. "That's exactly it. We confuse the institution with the presence. We think if the building rejects us, God rejects us. But God doesn't live in buildings. God lives in moments like this, in people who choose to see each other's humanity." Years passed. Margaret never became rich, never got her husband back. She heard through mutual friends that Daniel had remarried, moved to Oregon, started over with someone new. It stung at first, that knowledge, but eventually it just became another fact, something that had happened to someone she used to be. She never returned to the life she'd lost, but she built something better. The support group expanded into a network across 3 counties. She partnered with legal aid organizations to help women file restraining orders and custody paperwork. She worked with landlords to create transitional housing for women leaving abusive situations. She started a scholarship fund for single mothers trying to go back to school. She built a legacy from her pain. And every time someone thanked her, every time someone said, "You saved my life," she thought about that storm, that locked door, that old man who'd seen her when she'd felt invisible. She thought about how close she'd come to giving up, how easy it would have been to let the darkness win. One afternoon, 7 years after that rainy night, Margaret received a call from a journalist writing a story about grassroots organizations helping domestic violence survivors. The journalist wanted to interview her, to feature her work in a national magazine. Margaret agreed, not for the recognition, but because she knew the story would reach women who needed to hear it. During the interview, the journalist asked, "What made you start this organization? What was the moment you knew this was your calling?" Margaret thought for a long time before answering. "I stood at a church door in the rain," she said, "and they wouldn't let me in. And I realized that if the people who were supposed to represent God could turn away someone drowning, then I needed to become the person I'd needed that day. I needed to be the open door." The article ran 3 months later with a photo of Margaret, surrounded by women from her group, all of them smiling, all of them survivors. Her phone didn't stop ringing for weeks. Women from across the country reached out, asking for guidance, asking how to start similar groups in their communities, asking for hope. Margaret answered every call, every email, every message, because she remembered what it felt like to reach out and find nothing but locked doors. And sometimes, late at night, she'd think about that church with the locked doors. She'd think about the people inside, warm and safe and certain of their righteousness. And she'd wonder if they ever thought about the woman they turned away, if they ever realized they'd missed the whole point. She heard years later that the church had closed, membership dwindled, the congregation aged, and their children didn't return. Doors locked permanently. The building was sold to a developer who turned it into luxury condos, and Margaret felt no satisfaction in that, only sadness, because they'd had a chance to be light, and they chose to be a fortress instead. They'd chosen comfort over compassion, tradition over truth, exclusion over embrace. But Margaret became the light they refused to be. She became the open door. She became the voice that said, "You belong here, no matter who you are, or what you've done, or how broken you feel." And in doing that, she found what she'd been searching for all along, not a building, not an institution, but a purpose, a calling, a reason to keep the candle burning even when the storms never seemed to end. She thought about the old man sometimes, wondered if he was still there in that leaning chapel, still opening doors for lost souls in storms. She'd driven back to that dirt road twice, trying to find it again, but the road looked different in daylight, and the chapel was nowhere to be seen. Maybe it had collapsed, maybe she'd imagined it, or maybe some doors only open once at exactly the moment you need them, and then they close forever because their purpose has been fulfilled. Margaret decided it didn't matter whether the chapel had been real or a fevered hallucination brought on by hypothermia and despair. Real or imagined, that night had changed her. That candle still burned inside her, and she'd spent every day since trying to pass that light to others. That was enough. That was everything. One Tuesday night, 10 years after that storm, a new woman came to the group. She sat in the back, hood up, arms crossed, looking like she wanted to disappear. Margaret recognized that posture immediately. That's what I looked like, she thought. That's what giving up looks like before you've completely let go. After the meeting, the woman approached hesitantly. "I don't know if I belong here," she said quietly. "I haven't been abused. She paused, struggling. "I just feel like I'm drowning, and I don't know why. Like everything in my life is fine on paper, but inside I'm screaming." Margaret smiled gently, remembering a time when she would have said the same thing. "You don't need a specific kind of pain to deserve help," she said. "You don't need permission to be struggling. You just need to be human. And humans aren't meant to drown alone. Come back next week. Just try it." The woman nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks, and Margaret knew. Another candle was about to be lit. Another person was about to discover that locked doors aren't the end of the story. They're just the beginning of a different one. Because that's how light spreads. Not through grand gestures or miraculous interventions, but through small acts of seeing each other. Through saying you matter when the world says you don't. Through opening doors when everyone else has locked theirs. Through refusing to let the darkness win. One person at a time, one moment at a time, one act of grace at a time. Margaret had learned in the years since that storm that God doesn't always show up in churches with stained glass and organs and perfectly ordered pews. Sometimes God shows up in strangers who become friends, in basements where broken people gather to heal, in the voice that says, "Keep going," when everything says, "Stop." In the courage to build something new from the ruins of something destroyed. And she'd learned that the world is full of locked doors, but it's also full of people willing to open theirs. You just have to keep walking until you find them. You just have to keep knocking until someone answers. You just have to keep believing that somewhere in the darkness, a light is still burning. And maybe if you're brave enough, You become that light for someone else. That's what churches were supposed to be all along. Not buildings that exclude, not institutions that judge, but people who see each other's brokenness and say me too. People who hold space for pain without trying to fix it. People who understand that sometimes the most sacred thing you can offer another human being is simple presence. Showing up, being there, keeping the door open. If you found meaning in this story, subscribe for more like it. Leave a like to help others find their way here. Turn on notifications so you never miss a message. Your support helps us keep sharing these truths. Until next time.